Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here this afternoon. If you could please silence your cell phones at this time. My name is Miguel Perez. I am the Associate Director of Engagement Programs here at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I am thrilled to welcome you all here today and to introduce our speaker, Jonathan Tavares, as he shares the journey of the Noble Dos Aguas Armory as it came here to the Art Institute of Chicago in 1927. It's actually pretty exciting. Jonathan is a curator in our Applied Arts of Europe department, and he recently gave this exact same presentation at a conference in Spain. So we are very excited for Jonathan to bring it home to Chicago. If you could all please join me in welcoming Jonathan to the stage.
Thanks so much, Miguel. It's such a pleasure to speak to you all today about this subject. Just as Miguel said, I was just this November in Cordoba in Spain at a conference on Spanish aristocratic armories. Needless to say, it was a small conference. But this talk is a little bit different. I'm more telling you the story, again, of, as you see in the title, the journey of the Dos Aguas Armory, which I will tell you all about. But first, let us advance. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So, the material culture of chivalry in warfare, that is, arms and armor, was essential to the noble principles of splendor and magnificence that governed all aspects of Renaissance court culture. Whether for ceremony or defense, luxury arms were considered a high art in the 16th century, consistently valued above paintings and tapestry. And in the Gothic and Renaissance revival of the 19th and 20th centuries, the importance of this art form was once again celebrated and collected. Here at the Art Institute, the Art Institute is fortunate to have its own highly esteemed collection, among the finest in America. And like many collections of its type, the story of its formation is a fascinating one, full of mystery and intrigue. This afternoon, it's my pleasure to present to you what is one of the most significant portions of that story: the acquisition of 16th century arms and armor from the Armory of the Marquis dos Aguas of Valencia, Spain. Our story begins, of course, with the intrepid collector, this gentleman, George F. Harding Jr., a major Chicagoan real estate magnate who was once said to have owned a third of the city. Harding not only carved a vast empire of property, but also took up public office, holding such distinguished posts as comptroller for the city of Chicago, Cook County treasurer, and finally state senator. And if these aspirations toward feudal power were not enough, in 1927 he built his own castle as well, as seen here in this stone addition to his otherwise contemporary home, complete with ramparts and arrow slits and turrets. To fill his new baronial hall, Harding combed all over Europe, particularly Germany and England, for medieval and Renaissance furniture, paintings, sculpture, early musical instruments, and most especially arms and armor, which formed the heart of his passion for collecting. Kindled by boyhood dreams, reading Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, Harding succeeded in amassing one of the larger private collections of arms and armor in America. Beginning in the 1920s and continuing until his death in 1939, it numbered over 1,200 pieces, mostly of European origin. But of all these pieces he owned, the group of armors acquired from the Dos Aguas Armory in Spain in 1927 would form part of the crown jewels of his collection. After his death, Harding left his collection as a museum, until his castle in Hyde Park was pulled down to make way for an urban renewal project in 1963. However, after many trials and tribulations over some decades and through a court settlement, Harding's legacy lives on today in the Art Institute, where nearly all of it was deposited in 1982. Here on display in the Arms and Armor galleries is the pinnacle of the Dos Aguas Armory. Two armors produced in Milan, Italy, around 1570, covered in finely etched and brightly gilded bands of decoration, a fine expression of the armorer's art. Indeed, it was the rumor of these very harnesses that first drew Harding's attention to the Dos Aguas Armory in the first place. But before revealing how these splendid armors made their way to Chicago, it's worth exploring first the history of the noble family that owned them. These armors, along with crossbows, maces, battle axes, firearms, and swords, were all housed in this extravagant Baroque palace of the Marquises dos Aguas, built over a late 15th century building that was remodeled in the 1740s. The palace was the grandest in Valencia. Today, it is home to the González Martí National Ceramics Museum. The most imposing feature of the palace is this grand portal carved in alabaster with two Atalan figures representing dos aguas, literally two rivers. And you can see the water sort of flowing out along the sides there as a suggestion. Above, in the center of the portal, is the family's coat of arms, declaring their noble lineage, a reminder of the chivalric past when the shield formed the center of an armored medieval knight's defenses. Here, the blazon or shield is densely quartered or divided with the arms of many of the most important families of Valencia in the region of Catalonia, all intermarried, the counts of Albatera, the Rocamberti and Rocaful, and the barons of Bitrera and the lords of Perelada and others. Like the accumulation of these family blazons on the coat of arms, the actual family armory, that is, the collected and stored private arms and armor, was also a hereditary accumulation, rather than a collection of pieces acquired in the antiques market of the Gothic revival of the 19th century. Later, I'll demonstrate why this point is highly significant in relation to the armor's preservation and the rarity of its condition and survival. Untouched by the antiques trade, the sort of objects curators crave to discover for the information that they reveal. As an accumulation, however, without any known early written documentation, it is now difficult to reconstruct exactly which pieces belong to which branch of the family. Considering the history of this family, the title Dos Aguas was first granted to a baron in 1496 to one Gainier Rabassa. In a later generation, during the 17th century, the Baron Gainier Raymond Rabassa married Maria de Rocaful, establishing ties to another important noble Valencian family. And in 1670, this same Maria became the heiress to the Count of Albatera and the Baron of Bitrera and the Lord of Perelada, inheriting the Renaissance Palace of Albatera, which is likely to have had an armory. The traditional provenances of the two Dos Aguas armors in the Art Institute were said to be those of the Counts of Albatera and Perelada, suggesting that it was indeed this inheritance that formed the nucleus of the Dos Aguas armory. This illustrated manuscript is from soon after this period of consolidated inheritance with the Rocaful family, and is a written pedigree or family history. And I especially like how the painter has depicted these little cupids playing around with the family's armor, which is sort of synonymous with the rights and proof of nobility, especially in Spain, where nearly all noble families kept and maintained personal armories, a phenomenon that became especially evident by the mid-16th century in social emulation of the royal family. Continuing this tradition, by the turn of the 20th century, the armory was long part of the Dos Aguas family's noble patrimony, a rare survival that outlasted the 18th and 19th century, when it was not always fashionable to maintain such familial antiquities in other parts of Europe. And here we see the armory as it was proudly displayed publicly at the 1910 Exposition Nacional in Valencia. At that time, the collection was the property of the Marquesa de Dos Aguas, Rosalia Dasi Moreno, who would die only 4 years later, leaving the armory and the Palace Dos Aguas to her husband, Guillermo Casanova Valles, the Marquis de Gatero, who would sell the armory in 1927. The story of George Harding's acquisition of the Dos Aguas Armory begins with the travels of this charismatic connoisseur of arms, Dr. Bashford Dean, first curator of arms and armor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as curator of prehistoric ichthyology, or the study of fishes, at the Natural History Museum, and a professor at Columbia University. Dean was a visionary and a voracious collector who would stop at nothing to build the Metropolitans in his own collection. And as we can see from the photo on the left, he was not above wearing the collection when the opportunity arose. Sometime in 1925 or 26, Dean traveled to Spain and came across the Dos Aguas Armory and began negotiations with the Marquis through an intermediary agent, a vice consul to Spain in Barcelona, Manuel Soler. Before Dean departed the Palace Dos Aguas, he would sketch several of the armors that caught his eye and make careful lists of each piece in several vitrines built into the upper floor armor gallery in the palace. And this is the armor detailed in Dean's sketch now in the Art Institute. With very little funds at his disposal, Dean had to find other creative means to acquire the Dos Aguas Armory for the Metropolitan's collection. Knowing he would not be able to purchase the entire armory, Dean managed to muster the requisite finances through a unique agreement between the Metropolitan Museum and George F. Harding, Jr., who he enticed with the promise of golden armor. And Dean also approached Archer M. Huntington, who was the renowned collector of Spanish art and founder of the Hispanic Society of America in New York City, and George D. Pratt, a prominent trustee of the Metropolitan and an antiquarian, to offer significant funds on behalf of the Metropolitan. To negotiate the purchase with the Marquis, Dean sent his very able assistant, Miss Anita Reinhardt, to Valencia. A member of the Arms and Armor Department at the Metropolitan Museum since 1916, Miss Reinhardt was 40 when she received her, quote, marching orders from Dr. Dean, and then embarked on a steamer on February 19th, 1927, destined to Paris. At Paris, she would board a train to Barcelona and travel to Valencia, where she was instructed to have an initial interview with their agent, Manuel Soler. Then she was to meet with the Marquis at the palace to discuss the price, check up on each piece as listed in Dean's notes from his prior trip. Remarkably, the record of what transpires is fully documented in a correspondence file in the Metropolitan's Arms and Armor Archive, which preserves all the letters, cables between Dean, Reinhardt, and their agent, Manuel Soler. Prophetically, in one of the first letters to Miss Reinhardt, dated February 14th, Dean informs her, quote, "Don't forget that such an affair is full of surprises, many disconcerting ones, even a checkmate. So don't be disturbed if changes of plan occur all along the line. One has to tread gently on a path like this." End quote. At the close of the letter, Dean wishes Miss Reinhardt all the best for, quote, "the success of our quest for the golden armor." From the record, we find that Dean opened negotiations offering the Marquis $50,000 with $5,000 commission to Soler, the agent, for the purchase of the entire armory. After Reinhardt's meeting with the Marquis on March 4th, she sends a telegram to Dean, quote, refused flat, coldly received, claims offer here 70 net, thinks we are able to do more, asks can't or won't do better, which I discourage, knows really interested only in the gilded pieces, end quote. And so Miss Reinhardt's troubles begin. By March 9th, she was cabling Dean to ask if $75,000 was possible. Dean then begins to play the cat and mouse game remotely with his telegrams to Miss Reinhardt via their agent Soler. He states, "Now they ask 70 plus 10% commission, nothing doing. Be prepared to cancel everything and return immediately." Dean then sends a second wire directly to Miss Reinhardt at the same time saying, "Bluff pleasantly. Show Soler my cable sent today," through him. In reality, Dean had no intention of canceling and sending Reinhardt home. Soler and the Marquis called Dean's bluff, though, as they continued to refuse. Here, by March 20th, Reinhardt refers in code to the Marquis in letters to Dean as the enemy. Dean, who is now in Paris working on other acquisitions, writes on that same day a letter of encouragement, and he instructs Reinhardt to offer $75,000 and notes that, quote, "The danger point is competition. So let me know if any serious rivals are on the field, but above all, show not the slightest obvious interest." Miss Reinhardt is then instructed in another letter to raise the offer to $82,000, and soon after, Dean sends a telegram in clear terms to Reinhardt, quote, "Get everything purchased, objects eternal, trouble temporary, Dean." And on March 24th, Reinhardt writes to Dean after the offer was finally accepted, quote, "Do we, or rather I, seem to have muddled through somehow after all, and the enemy will accept 350,000 pesadas net for himself, export taxes and commission extra." Yesterday, the Marquis put all the cards on the table to Soler. A dealer from Madrid had made an offer once or twice, but the housekeeper at Valencia did not like or trust him, and she has now advised the Marquis to accept your offer, which is sure, hence this sudden about-face, end quote. At the close of the letter, Reinhardt asks Dean, quote, Am I to stay on in Spain until objects packed for shipment? That probably means 2 more weeks. Can I now go to Madrid, where I'm supposed to be anyway, and make good on my bluff, and return when the time is ripe to check up? Am glad I'm free to come, quote, out of exile in this hotel, though I do not regret having this way kept in closer touch with the events and reaction of my departure. What Miss Reinhardt is referring to is the final trick that made the Marquis capitulate and accept the Metropolitan's offer. Soler advised Miss Reinhardt to pretend to leave en route to Madrid, but in reality, she only moved to a different hotel in Barcelona. Thus, quote, a sure offer with money on the table was seemingly to be lost. Apparently, the ruse worked, as the Marquis rapidly instructs Soler to send word to Reinhardt to return. The next complication in the acquisition of the Armory was that the Marquis did not want the public to know that he was essentially selling his late wife's patrimony. He made the Metropolitan firmly agree to keep his name or that of Dos Aguas confidential for at least 30 years or until his death. Clearly, we're after that mark now. To prevent knowledge from getting out, the pieces were removed from the palace in several carloads under the cover of night through a back door. The Marquis' chauffeur would drive the pieces from Valencia a long distance to the Marquis' apartment in Barcelona, where they were documented and prepared for custom papers. Reinhardt remarked at how poor the photographs were, as can be seen. Most of what is in this picture is now in the Art Institute's collection. There was such a fear of words slipping out, despite the exportation being entirely legal, Ms. Reinhardt wrote to Dean that, quote, "The Marquis refused to let me give anything to the housekeeper, but he is entirely willing that I should give the concierge in Valencia something to keep quiet. He does not trust him." Soler thought 1,500 pesadas. It seemed to me that 1,000 is more than enough. 500 now and 500 in a month if nothing gets out. The owner, the Marquis, typed the contract, and now I am invited to lunch at the country club to watch him play golf? What next? This surely is a funny world. And after the packing was concluded, there was yet another complication. Waiting an extra few weeks to clear customs. And on May 4th, Ms. Reinhardt wearily expressed to Dean, "Tomorrow will be just 9 weeks since my arrival. You had hoped negotiations would take 2 to 3. Or perhaps you just said so in order not to discourage me too much. Certainly could I have foreseen events here, I doubt if I should have had the courage then to come." And on the 31st of May, the shipment was finally sent and made its way to New York. This is what the Dos Aguas Palace Armory looked like after the deed was done. The records show that on April 9th, Harding cabled payment to Barcelona of $58,512.40, just under $1 million in today's dollars. More than half the funds for the Armory. In recognition for this, Harding was given first choice when the pieces arrived in New York City in June. Naturally, this his first selection was the gilded armor. In total, the purchase of the Armory was $83,089.97. That's $1,400,000 in today's dollars. Harding was pleased with his purchase, as the pieces took a prominent place in his collection. With this tale of toil and triumph, let us now turn to the beauty and splendor of the spoils. If Harding took the flashy gilded pieces of armor, the Metropolitan, under Dr. Dean's guidance, picked the more unusual rare pieces. For example, this armor of about 1570, produced in the major armor-making center of Milan, Italy, and at that time, part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. Likely made for some unknown noble ancestor to the Dos Aguas, it is one of the most complete so-called armor garnitures produced in Milan that is known. That is to say that it consists of this core field armor that could be used in war for heavy cavalry, that can then be supplemented with similarly decorated additional pieces, such as these designed specifically for the tournament or sport of the joust in the Italian fashion. And I think you can see these are the extra pieces as they are configured on the armor, and this is this reinforced that's there. This is the sort of jousting tournament in which the armor would have functioned, with two opponents charging at each other with blunted lance, hoping to strike and gain points. And then, most rare, it could be converted from this configuration for the joust in the Italian fashion to this, with interchangeable pieces made to suit participation in the joust in the German fashion. It suggests the position of a Spanish noble diplomat who would have traveled to Italian and German courts and had to adapt his armor to suit these regional needs. The added plates are reinforcers that serve to bolster the armor on the left side, which receive the blows from the opponent's lance. It is the main scoring or target area for the joust. While the etched armor garniture is not among the most lavish in the Metropolitan's collection, it is celebrated for its completeness. When so many other tournament armors from armories have lost all these additional pieces through the ravages of time. There are many other fragments of arms in helmets, as well as armors that represent the other half of the Dos Aguas Armory today in the Metropolitan Museum. But for the remainder of this presentation, I will discuss those pieces in the Art Institute. Now for George F. Harding in Chicago, it was undoubtedly this etched in gilded field armor that most impressed him and placed high on his list. It too is a garniture, but not for the joust, rather for cavalry use on the battlefield, as with this helmet and pair of knee and thigh defenses that you see there. Together with this matching pair of armored saddle plates and the chafron, or defense for the horse's head. And also for a different type of tournament, not the mounted joust, but tournament on foot, this exchange helmet and right shoulder defense, or pauldron. And when applied and configured for the foot tournament, the armor transforms into this. The configuration, it can be currently seen in our galleries. This armor was clearly valued quite highly by the mid-19th century Marquis dos Aguas, as the ceiling in the Red Room in the palace is romantically painted with a depiction of the then Marquis around 1866, wearing this very armor from his hereditary collection. And you can see him right there, and a detail right here. And it is showing the helmet, this helmet right here by his feet. Shown previously with Dr. Dean's sketch, there is yet another gilded half armor for use in tournament on foot from the Dos Aguas Armory that Harding acquired. It is from the same time and place of manufacture, and one wonders if it was made for a different member of the same family or a different branch. As mentioned, family tradition recounted these two armors as those of the Counts of Albatera and Perelada. Curatorially, having both armors in the collection afforded a rare instance where one could display two contemporary family armors engaged in the tournament they were designed for. And so when planning the current displays some 6 years ago, I could not resist pairing them opposite each other with carefully reconstructed costume and, of course, feather panaches. This print commemorates such a tournament in Lorraine some decades later than the Dos Aguas Armors. The image, however, does well to illustrate the grandeur of these events. A cross between sport and opera, with parades, floats, pyrotechnics, and the assimilation of real combat, albeit safe with blunted spears. Contestants scored with each broken or splintered spear, as seen in the center encounter. And here you see this opponent has just struck on the side here, and his spear has broken. And here there are men holding many spears, and a page would hand them a new one. I also want to point out who are the onlookers, but the ladies of the court that are spread out by their wide skirts. Looking closely at the upper visor of the helmet on one of the Dos Aguas armors, there is clear evidence of use. An abundance of angled cuts and dents from blunted swords and the deep scratches from the head of blunted spears. But none as prominent as the large patch of lost decoration above the proper left vision slit that you're seeing there. This was the intended scoring area for the blunted spears, hit so often that the etched and gilded ornament is sheared off, an excellent example of how these armors function despite their extravagant decoration. Other smaller supplementary garniture pieces were preserved in the Dos Aguas Armory, like this, an open-faced morion, a type of helmet that assimilated the fashionable brimmed hat in the late 16th century, decorated ensuite with a round shield, both intended for infantry use in battle. Inexplicably, there's also a matching chevron to protect the horse's head that would have served for cavalry use. This type of small garniture of shield and morion helmet were often used in the period by noble infantry commanders, both for actual protection and, as seen here, in courtly events and civic parades as a sign of rank. The captain is depicted kneeling to a superior, while his page boy is holding his shield and wearing his matching helmet, prepared to give to the captain at will. Note also the panache of feathers decorating the helmet, an integral part of the ensemble that never survives. Delving even deeper, when analyzing the etched and gilded decoration of these pieces, one finds the typical allegorical figures that are represented over and over again on armor in the late 16th century. Detailed here from the bands of decoration etched on the shield are the figures representing the four cardinal virtues as espoused by Plato in ancient Greece and celebrated in the Renaissance. They remind the noble owner or anyone looking at it to exercise prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And as the Renaissance culture mixes classical antiquity with Christianity, the decoration on the shield also includes the representation of the theological virtues from St. Paul: faith, hope, and charity. As mentioned, the pieces from the Dos Aguas Armory are particularly remarkable for certain anomalies of preservation. These aspects are not necessarily unique, but they are seldom found. And when they are found, in generally, they are from a context of hereditary armories such as this, where objects receive benign neglect, never handed to a restorer and stripped. This morion helmet is such an example, as it retains its cheek pieces, something almost always lost as they hang from internal leather straps that can tear or disintegrate over time. One of the cheek pieces, though, is a modern replacement. Can you guess which one? It was added when the pieces were cleaned for George Harding before shipping to Chicago, when in New York at the Metropolitan Museum they were restored by this gentleman, Daniel Tachot, a French émigré armorer and restorer working for the Metropolitan from 1909 until his death in 1928, so just after, actually, the Dos Aguas pieces coming to the Met. His tools and even his metal cabinets he stored scraps in are still maintained at the Metropolitan. And when I worked there over a decade ago, I saw this rare fragment of a Morian cheek piece from one of these scrap drawers. Years later, I realized it was the remainder of the replaced or restored cheek piece on the Art Institute's Morion from the Dos Aguas Armory. Apparently, the very lowest portion of the cheek piece, this is these last two plates that you see on the one on ours, was missing. But instead of restoring just those two pieces, they replaced the entire piece. I suspect that so rare was an authentic fragment of a cheek piece, the curator Bashfordine saved it and sent the copy with Harding's restored helmet. Significantly, though, it is uncleaned and shows the black color of the armor before it was polished at the Metropolitan for Harding. And I should say, by the way, the Metropolitan has agreed to eventually send the fragment to us, since it is certainly from our helmet. Another rare aspect to this small garniture is the survival of period linings that is almost always lost. On the left is a detail of the velvet backing on the round shield. We can see the red velvet is actually a later, possibly 19th century addition, but through this little tear that you're seeing here, the original salmon pink velvet with twisted silver threaded braid is revealed. And you can see that just there. There's the braid. In the other detail on the right, the overturned brim of the helmet shows the original lining band held by rivets, that's this portion here, and the remains of the lining pulling away, revealing the raw linen or flax used for padding the red silk taffeta lining over it. The most astonishing piece from the Dos Aguas Armory in the Art Institute is this late 16th century Turkish helmet known as a shishak or chichak, made of gilded copper. It would have been worn by an Ottoman officer with a massive plume or egret feathers, as seen in this period woodcut. This helmet is also preserved with its original lining intact. For an arms and armor scholar, this is shocking and nearly unprecedented. But the question remains, how did this Ottoman helmet end up in a Spanish family armory? We know from other Spanish noble armories, and indeed in other parts of Europe, that there was a strong tradition to keep, maintain, and display trophies of arms, that is, the captured arms, armor, and banners of their vanquished enemies to commemorate the victory for generations. This helmet almost certainly was taken by or given to a forebearer of the Dos Aguas, perhaps even from this famous sea battle of Lepanto, where the Spanish were part of the so-called Holy League that defeated the Ottomans in October of 1571 off the coast of western Greece, then bolstering European trade on the Mediterranean. In the royal armories in Madrid of the Habsburg monarchs, the helmet of the Ottoman commander of Lepanto, Ali Pasha, is similarly preserved. Unfortunately, the Dos Aguas family tradition has not passed down along with the helmet, and the origin of its is only speculative at this point. In the case of this Spanish crossbow with lever for spanning the bow, one of several from the Dos Aguas Armory, there is a family tradition passed down that they were taken as trophies during the Morisco uprising in Granada around 1570. The Moriscos were the population of Spain descended from Islamic Moors or North Africans. For generations, they had been forcibly converted to Christians and progressively experienced ever-increasing social restrictions to the point that there was a revolt in the southern region of Granada where they were most concentrated. The revolt was brutally squashed under Philip II of Spain. And at least one chronicler mentions that the Moriscos used a lot of crossbows while defending their position in the mountains of the Spanish Sierra Nevada. Dating to about 1530 to 50, the crossbow itself was likely a generation or more older when used in the revolt. Whereas most European countries rejected the crossbow for military use by the late 15th century, Spain maintained it as a viable weapon well into the late 16th century, particularly on ships and in expeditions into North and South America. The Art Institute is fortunate to have two extremely well-preserved examples from the Dos Aguas Armory. They serve as a foil to understanding the fragmented remains discovered on Spanish shipwrecks and excavations in Texas and in New Mexico. I've only highlighted a portion of the Dos Aguas Armory in the Art Institute's collection, as there are further pieces of arms and armor here, as well as in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But to conclude, the negotiations and journey from Valencia in 1927 was clearly long and arduous. Nevertheless, the acquisition of the armory has proved to be extraordinary, not only for the grandeur of its golden armors, but also for the unique nature of its preservation. When taken as a whole, the armory documents the patronage of an aristocratic Spanish family during the so-called Golden Age of Spain's empire. Many other families' armories have not survived into the 20th century, either destroyed or scattered generations earlier. And those, too, make up the fabric of private and public collections, but with far less context. Though the Dos Aguas Armory was dispersed in modern times, the memory of it lives on in our galleries, and I invite you to visit those objects and enjoy their splendor. Thank you. And now I think we have some time for questions. And there will be two people with microphones to take your questions if you have any. Love questions. Anybody?
Yes, what percentage is this of our total collection of armor?
It's actually a very small percentage. I haven't done the math, but I want to say the Dos Aguas pieces number probably, depending on how you count, maybe about 20 to 25 objects. But if you take a whole armor as a single object, it's quite important and impressive. And I could do further analysis and say what percentage of full armors does the Dos Aguas represent. And there I would say that probably represents about 15% of our armor collection, 15 to 20%. Oh, well, 15 is probably more accurate. So that's significant. Almost entirely. Mm-hmm. We have made some acquisitions in the last 10 years, but they are much less. I can't see because the...
Me? What was the reaction to the Marquis's sale of his wife's collection?
Well, that's just it. There was no reaction. They were very successful at keeping this a secret. And that was the agreement, to keep it a secret at least for 30 years or until the Marquis died. And I do think he died somewhere around 10 years afterwards or so. So I don't think it was very much noticed. Certainly there were, to my knowledge, no newspaper articles or any criticisms that were launched. Of course, my Spanish colleagues regret this now. I went to Spain and I felt a little bit of the demon talking about what they don't have and what's now in America. But that was the job, and that's why I was asked to that conference to talk about the dispersal of Spanish aristocratic pieces. And then I did the case study of the Dos Aguas. But truth be told, the colleagues would also say that, the Palace Dos Aguas did not do well during the Civil War. This is not to say this is rightful or not, but had it stayed in the palace, it might have sustained some damage or issues. Even the royal armories in Madrid actually sustained major damage from a bomb that exploded in it during the Civil War. There's a give and a take here, but, it is unfortunate that it's divorced from its original context. But quite honestly, the family armory would have moved over and over and over again through the centuries. It is just, and it would have lost a lot as well, and it's hard to know how much. There is only one inventory that has been found, and it is from the early 19th century, and it doesn't actually reveal very much. And I can, for the most part, identify the pieces that exist today that we know are in the armory from the inventory. But no earlier provenance is given, sadly. So that was an extended answer to your excellent question. But any other questions? Yes.
Hi. You mentioned how it's rare to have two surviving pieces from the same period and context. How did you make the choices around the rest of the costuming and panache, given the stakes?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. So I tried to do both in the galleries. There are, you can see here in the periphery, armors that are experienced as specimens where we have not gone to the length of introducing recreations of costume. But in the center of the display, we wanted to wake the armor up. We wanted to make it come to life for the visitors and give them that experience as well. So we partnered with the School of Historical Dress in London, where we looked at surviving examples of clothing and copied them. Everything was hand-stitched. Even the fabrics used, some of the velvets were handmade. And they followed patterns of actually some of the clothes found in tombs. Then we've also used portraiture from exactly that decade. For instance, the trunk hose that are embroidered here, they copy the embroidery from the pattern on the etching. So sometimes the embroidery was meant to match the etching. And we know that, again, from certain portraits. And that's what made us come up with that. Now, the feathers themselves are also copied from portraits of figures who would have participated or were documenting the costume and armor that they wore for this kind of tournament. So we had a lot of documentary evidence, visual evidence to go on for this. Even the stances they're in come from a book, of sort of fighting manual on how to stand and do this kind of tournament. So I feel like we were very well informed. There's always going to be, something that might be off or wrong or what have you, because we are recreating it in the 21st century. But I thought we should try. So it is controversial, but there you have it. I think there was some question. Yes?
So allow me to ask the question that's gone through everyone's mind that no one has asked. How much was this designed for function instead of just beauty? Or was it designed for beauty and function second?
The answer is both. And so the Dos Aguas Armory, the pieces I presented to you are all functional, both in the parade sense, but more especially in the sense of the battlefield and the tournament grounds. And that's why I point out, actually, you saw a detail of the helmet of this piece. And bear with me, I'm going to go back. It's worth it. There it is. I love this piece, and usually you don't get to see this because the armors go through restorers in the antiques trade, particularly in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, they wanted clean armor, mostly. So they would have ground all this down. They might have even re-etched that area. And I have seen that on a lot of armors and in our collection too. But because this passed through the family for so long and was not aggressively restored, we have it intact with all the dents and the cuts and the losses and unapologetically. So I get to show this, we get to show this, the museum gets to show this in its state of how it would have been used. And it shows you, despite all of the gilding, all of the decoration, it was indeed intended for use. And indeed, this helmet does weigh about 8 pounds. That's substantial, it's thick. It's meant to protect you against all these blows. And one of them even still has the lining, not this helmet, but the other one opposite, for the chin. And I can tell you, it has a lot of grime in it. So this is one of the wonders of the Dos Aguas Armory. None of these pieces are incredibly rare in themselves, but it's the preservation that they're in that is rare, and telling for us, and exciting for us. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
You mentioned that you were very surprised to see the intact lining. Why doesn't it usually survive, and why is it so valuable?
Yes. So what happens usually, oops, did I go too far? No, I didn't. What happens usually is the rivets in these leather bands that are the rivets attach rot away. And this is where the lining is stitched, and so the lining just falls out. But it's also silk. Silk shatters over a long period of time. It's very fragile if it is exposed to light, especially. And you're seeing the silk pulling away here. It's been repaired multiple times. So that's what makes this so rare, is that it didn't get reused over and over again. Maybe it wasn't handled excessively. It wasn't reused perhaps in a lot of different pageants for some reason or another, and that does happen in family armories too. And so it has this functionality still preserved into it. But it is organic material in it. It does interact with humidity, temperature controls, all of those things, and it falls away. So that's where it's really rare. And of course, in this Turkish helmet, it is incredibly rare that it even has some of this braid that is riveted along the sides and the two braided pieces that keep the cheek piece intact, hanging. You never see that. Usually it tears and falls off. So this must have been cared for very, dare I say, lovingly, in a way. The only thing that's funny to see is that this area, and this area has been torn away so that someone could take the hinges off, take the piece off, clean it, and put it back on. But it's just a little bit of a tell. But otherwise, I don't know too many of the Turkish helmets in America that still have their lining. Any other questions? Yes?
Yes, so I think you perhaps have known these from us on
Well,
And also, my other question was, do you know if the hit size has changed over the centuries?
okay. So the question is twofold. How did they see out of these things and interact and all that? And also size of individuals. So I'll answer the second question first. I'm not an anthropologist, but my understanding of 16th century Europeans is that anthropologically, the average height of a male was about 5'6" to 5'7". So only a couple of inches shorter than the average now, 5'8", 5'9". So anthropologically, people in that period, believe it or not, were not that much smaller than us. And that also depends on diet and genetics and where you are in Europe. And the armors bear that out, actually. This armor is above 6 feet. These two armors are fairly in that median. In fact, True Confessions of a Curator, and this helps answer your first question. This armor I have worn. And why did I do that? To get the two stances of the figures that you have there, it just so happens that armor fits me exactly. I'm 5'8". And I wore it for all of 10 minutes to stand in those two positions and have a photographer take 10 pictures of me in the round so that we could then send it to our sculptor, who then sculpted the figures in those two stances. And then they took measurements off of my body. So a funny story, and this is very egotistic, this is me fighting against me. And it makes me wonder, is these two armors for the same person? I don't know. We don't know the answer to that. There's a slight size difference, I'm not sure. I haven't done the measurements completely from one armor to another. But that gets to the second question. I have worn this helmet. Your peripheral view is limited to about, you start to see about here, as opposed to like here. So that's narrowed. But otherwise, think about it as like looking through Venetian blinds. If you can't really see through the blinds, but if you go up really close to it, you can see quite a bit past it. And it's similar for a helmet. The weight, that armor weighs about, I think altogether, about 25, almost 30 pounds. But a modern, the modern contemporary, the current outer tactical vest that is worn by today's military weighs 30 pounds. So armor today is not so different from armor in that period, actually. It's made to articulate very well. So one of my great regrets is when you come to our installation and you see the armor static and standing in these glass cases, you're missing half of the artistry because part of it is the articulation, the way it's meant to move with the human body. And so that's what these dioramas are attempting to do, is to wake it up, make it look much more kinetic. Because armor is almost like a form of kinetic sculpture. It is meant to be clothing, and it actually mimics the textile clothing that you wear under it as well. All of these decorations, they're arranged in bands because it's mimicking the embroidery of that period. And you can date an armor almost precisely to the decade because of the decoration and the shape and silhouette, just like the cut and silhouette of clothing. But anyway, it is very movable. You wouldn't want to spend a long period of time because what is real is, getting sweaty and, hyperventilating and not having enough ventilation, especially in heat. So that is a real problem. Yes, in the middle, yeah.
Thanks for taking my question. So I have the impression that this is for recreational use, not for warfare. You've talked about jousting. I'm wondering, could you talk just a bit more about the jousting? Like, was the point of it just to knock someone over? Were there teams? Was it done in a certain season? Was it like their NFL or more like polo?
Were there circuits? So the question is an excellent one, what was the joust and how did it function? It's so much easier to show with an image. So jousts, I often assimilate jousting in the period to the way business executives have to play golf today. that they would receive training for it as a youth in continued training. They would have coaches, as it were, to instruct them, usually another nobleman who's very skilled in it, or horseman. And, you had to hold your own as a nobleman. This was the scene for networking amongst the noble families. The ruling class, the top whatever percent of society, this was for them and by them, and it was meant to show their wealth and status, but they had to be, able to participate. For instance, King Philip II of Spain, when he was a prince, and he was brought on progress by his father, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was brought to the Netherlands, to current-day Belgium and other places, and also throughout Germany. Charles V wanted Philip II to be the next emperor, to follow him in his footsteps. Charles V was a very jocular ruler. He loved to joust. He loved to actually command in the saddle at the battlefield. He actually participated in battles. That was not his son, Philip II. Philip II hated the joust. He had at least, I think, 2 accidents, one in which the horse fell on him and he injured his leg to some degree. This is a common injury. Henry VIII also experienced that. And so he absolutely hated it. He hated the danger of it, and certainly deaths could happen and did happen. But I think there was a sort of machismo that was expected. And in fact, the courts in Germany did not like Philip in the way that he was not able to hold himself as in this culture. So it mattered. It mattered in certain circles how you participated in these events. And what was the point? Well, the point of every joust was slightly different depending on where you were. There were different rules, different engagements. But this one you're seeing here, which is actually at the Vatican, by the way. Let's see if I can point it out. This is the Sistine Chapel over here. So this is the Belvedere Palace. So this is an ecclesiastic setting, but the princes of the church, the cardinals, bishops, the pope, they were all part of these noble families, and so the secular members of the family were, of course, participating in the joust. Here you see them waiting in the lines, ready to go when it's their turn. And you see the pages attending to them. This one is a difficult joust because there's no barrier between the horses. That means you have to maneuver the horses by yourself without aid of a barrier and prevent collision. It's incredibly hard. But they're trying to hit each other with blunted lances on that left side and break the lance and score points by breaking the lance. In this stage, it's not so much trying to unhorse the individual. It could happen, but that was not the main event. If you struck on the head, which is a harder target to hit, you scored more points. So mostly it was about breaking the lance and scoring a point that way. And you had usually about 3 or 4 passes. In other parts of Germany, particularly, they did try to still unhorse each other. And they had special saddles that helped facilitate that with less or no back to them so that you don't break your hips and things like that. So there's a lot to say about the joust. I would be a whole lecture in its own right. But it like many sports today, they had their own rules depending on where you went. And there was something like you would go here during this month or there. And so, again, depending on the court. And also certain events for weddings, and other great celebrations, feast days, saint days. Those were important events that a joust would be planned. Yeah. I think that's...
We have time for one more question, Jonathan.
Sure. Any takers? Yes.
Could you tell us more about how the Harding collection came here to the Art Institute?
Oh, it's such a Chicago story. The Harding collection came to the Art Institute in 1982 after a court settlement in 1981. Harding left his castle, his home, as a museum with an endowment when he died in 1939. He had, during his lifetime, spoken openly and even quoted in the press, in the Chicago Tribune, that he was considering giving the collection to the Art Institute. So that was always a possibility. And to be quite open and frank, and it is in public record, the collection was being mismanaged by the time we get to the 1960s. There was a board of trustees, largely run by a specific lawyer, And things were being sold from the collection. There was a whistle being blown anonymously that the early musical instruments that Harding owned were being sold at auction. The auction was stopped, but then the court allowed it to proceed. But then further investigation was done by the state's attorney over, I think, a year or several years, in fact. And the collection was in limbo. It was on display in the John Curator Library from the 1960s into the 70s. And then in the 70s, that library was torn down. So the collection went into crates. And that's when all of this was going on. Essentially, it's a long story, but essentially, during the trial with the Board of Trustees of the Harding Museum, it was decided to just settle and have the entire collection ceded over to the Art Institute along with the endowment. And the endowment wasn't massive, but it actually still pays for my salary. Amongst many other things. And now, of course, the collection came in 1982. It was displayed in the Long Hall in Gonzales, which is today the Southeast Asian material. That was always sort of a 20% of the collection on display. And now we can boast about 35, almost 40% of the collection is on display. And we opened, of course, the current galleries in March of 5 or 6 years. I should know off the top of my head, but not so long ago. And that's it. Well, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed. It's my pleasure.